Hello, this is Lauren Dunlap, Executive Director for Advocacy and Awareness for Immune Disorders Association, or AAIDA, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I am so pleased to host today's webinar. AAIDA's mission is to create awareness, advocate, and conduct research to help the greater than 25 million Americans living with immune disorders. I would also like to thank Allergy and Asthma Network for their continued support with AAIDA and assisting with educational webinars such as this. Today, we are thrilled to be presenting AAIDA's first of 12 educational webinars for 2021, and I will be joined by Dr. Meagan Spychala and Ms. Tonya Winders. Our first speaker will be Dr. Spychala, who will present Clinical Trials 101, What You Need to Know as You Consider Participation. Dr. Spychala, please proceed.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. And thanks everyone for joining the educational webinar today. As Lauren mentioned, I'm Meagan Spychala, and I'm really happy to be here today to discuss clinical trials. For me, clinical trials have been part of my life now for almost 20 years. I started working in clinical research to help people, mainly to support others in finding cures or treatments to the conditions that affect their everyday lives. So I'm
Dr.
very
Spychala,
proud.
I
Yes.
didn't mean to cut you off. I just realized I didn't introduce you all the way. And if I
Oh,
could
that's
just
okay.
introduce you right.
Absolutely.
So Dr. Spychala, Meagan Spychala is the Senior Director of Program Management of PPD in Morrisville, North Carolina. And Dr. Spychala holds a Doctorate of Public Health, a Master of Science in Biostatistics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Washington and Lee University. Dr. Spychala has over 15 years of clinical development experience providing scientific and technical oversight on trials of varying phases, sizes, therapeutic areas and indications, and complexities. Dr. Spychala has extensive knowledge of all facets of clinical development, inclusive of study design, protocol, writing, risk management, trial implementation, and regulatory submissions to support marketing applications. Dr. Spychala engages with sponsors as well as the patient advocacy community to develop the relationships needed to help support patients and family-centric clinical research. And I apologize. So now, Dr. Spychala, please proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. No worries. So yeah, I mean, as Lauren just said, I work at PPD currently, and PPD is a contract research organization that helps pharmaceutical and biotech companies conduct their clinical trials. To note the following disclaimer at the bottom of this slide, this presentation I'm giving expresses my own thoughts and opinions and not those of PPD. So with that housekeeping item under the rug, I'll begin. And really, I think with COVID especially, clinical trials and the Food and Drug Administration have been in the news and discussed probably more than ever before. But there is a lot to know and understand, especially if you or a loved one is considering study participation. So today, I'm going to discuss the types of clinical trials, common terminology, and then next steps if you're interested in participation. So first and foremost, what is a clinical trial? There are many definitions out there. I put two on this slide, one from the World Health Organization and the second from the National Institutes of Health. But said in a different way, a clinical trial is a type of study that evaluates whether an intervention works in humans. So an intervention can mean many different things, but examples could be a drug, a clinical care strategy, a device, or a procedure. So if thinking of the COVID studies that have been in the news a lot lately, the intervention would be that vaccine, that treatment, or a device that can test if you are COVID positive or not. In some autoimmune disease studies that I've worked on, some have been drug studies, but others have used stem cell transplants as the intervention. And then there have been other trials that have addressed different forms of counseling to support someone or to support their family. So there are a lot of different types of interventions that can be used in clinical trial conduct. And from the two definitions presented here, both of them state that clinical trials need an intervention. So you might also hear them called interventional trials. There are also observational studies that address health issues in large groups of people in natural settings. And these can be called natural history studies or patient registries, but that's not going to be the focus of our talk today. Today, we're really focusing in on interventional trials or clinical trials. So, what makes a clinical trial the fastest and safest way to determine whether experimental treatments or new ways of using known therapies are safe and effective is by having them run under controlled environments. And these controlled environments we call protocols. So a protocol is really like a playbook or a rule book for any given trial. And when developing a trial, there is a lot to consider. It starts all with knowing about the intervention and what the researcher or the pharmaceutical company want to show. So for the rest of my talk, instead of saying intervention, I'm going to be saying drug. Um, it is very similar between different types of interventions, the trial process, but for just ease of use, I'm going to use drug as my intervention. So clinical trials are conducted in phases. And before a drug can even be conducted or can even be used in humans, we need to understand whether it has the potential to cause serious harm. And this is what researchers call toxicity. And these studies that are done before going into humans are called preclinical studies and are typically run in labs and usually include animals. So preclinical studies really help determine potential doses for the first in human trials, and they provide information on toxicities. So the trials at each phase have a different purpose and help scientists answer different questions. So once you've run your animal studies or your preclinical studies and you're ready to start looking at what happens to the drug in humans, you're going to go into phase 1. So in phase 1 trials, researchers test a new drug in a very small group of people for the first time. And that's to evaluate its safety, to determine a safe dosage range, and to identify side effects. So side effects are any undesired actions or effects of the drug. So negative or adverse effects might include things like headache, nausea, hair loss, skin irritation, or other physical problems. And experimental treatments have to be evaluated for both immediate and long-term side effects. So during phase 1 studies, researchers test the new drug in healthy volunteers. So these are healthy people without the disease or condition. In most cases, up to 80, but sometimes up to 100 people participate in this phase 1 research. Depending on the drug, though, and who it is intended for, researchers can conduct phase 1 studies in those with a disease or condition. And examples of that are cancer research or trials using a gene therapy, because these therapies do have more safety risks and shouldn't be exposed to those who are healthy. Phase 1 studies are really closely monitored, and they gather information about how a drug interacts with the human body. And that's the most important thing for a phase 1 study, because this is the first time it's assessed in humans. So key terms you might see are pharmacokinetic, or PK, and pharmacodynamic, or PD, when looking at these trials. So PK, or pharmacokinetics, is what the body does to the drug. So researchers are interested in how the drug is absorbed, distributed throughout the body, metabolized by the body, and then also excreted. Pharmacodynamics, or PD, is what the drug does to the body. So PD refers to how the drug works and how it really exerts its power on the body. So evaluating the PK and PD of the drug in phase 1 trials allows researchers to determine the right dose to be given to the right patient population at the right time. So the key goals in phase 1 is to understand how the drug works in the body, how to best administer the drug, and that includes the timing to limit risks and maximize benefit, and most importantly, to understand the side effects um, associated with increased dosage. Because these trials tend to be short in duration, phase 1 studies focused most on immediate effects, and long-term effects are addressed in later phases. So getting more information on these key goals is incredibly important to help design phase 2. So in phase 2 trials, the study is given to a larger group of people to understand the potential for efficacy and to further evaluate safety. In phase 2 trials, researchers administer the drug to a group of patients with the disease or condition for which the drug is being developed. So, as I said, in phase 1, you're talking mainly about healthy volunteers. In phase 2, you're starting to go into the patient population that the drug is intended for. Phase 2 studies typically involve a few hundred patients. However, these studies aren't large enough to show whether the drug will be beneficial. So instead, phase 2 studies provide researchers with additional safety data and a glimpse into what could be the effectiveness of a given dose. So researchers then use this data and the understanding of some of the efficacy results and some of how if the drug is working and also how safe it is to design and develop their phase 3 protocols. And when people think of clinical trials, most people start thinking of phase 3 studies. This is where a study drug is given to a very large group of people to confirm its effectiveness, to monitor long-term side effects, and to collect information that will allow the drug or the treatment to be used safely. So researchers design phase 3 studies to demonstrate whether or not a product offers a treatment benefit to a specific population. These are sometimes known as pivotal studies and can involve several thousand participants, depending on the indication you're looking at or the disease or condition you're looking at. And phase 3 studies also provide most of the long-term safety data. So as I said, phase 1 studies start to look at the very short-term safety effects, but phase 3 studies are starting to look much more long-term about the different side effects that a drug could have. So in previous studies, it's possible that less common side effects might have gone undetected because there haven't been as many people and there hasn't been as long-term a follow-up. So because these studies are larger and longer in duration, you're more likely to show long-term or rare side effects. So phase 3 studies are very important. So after the phase 3 studies are completed, and if the drug is shown to have a benefit, then typically the pharmaceutical company will submit this data to the FDA by filing what's called a new drug application or an NDA. The FDA will then thoroughly review all of the data and information provided to determine a decision on whether to approve the drug. Often, the NDA contains sufficient data for the FDA to determine the safety and effectiveness of a drug. However, sometimes questions arise that require additional consideration. In these cases, the FDA may organize a meeting of one of its advisory committees to get independent expert advice and to permit the public to make comments. These advisory committees include a patient representative that provides input from the patient perspective. And then if approved, some sponsors will go into phase 4 studies. And phase 4 trials are also called post-marketing studies because they are started after the drug is already on the market. And they delineate additional information, including the drug's risks, benefits, and get more information on optimal use. So as I said, these are conducted after the drug has been approved by the FDA. So these are the types or the phases of clinical trial research. I've also included some percentages on what percent of the drugs make it to the next phase. So 70% of drugs that start in phase 1 will go to phase 2. 33% of drugs that start in phase 3 or phase 2 will move on to phase 3. And then 25 to 30% of drugs that are in phase 3 will end up going for FDA review. So that means if we have 100 new drugs that are starting to be tested in phase 1, only about 70 of them would move to phase 2. Then only about 23 of those would move to phase 3. And of those 23, only 7 would go to the FDA for approval. Also, if you look at the time frames, the length of study that are on the bottom of each phase, several months for phase 1, up to 2 years for phase 2, and up to 5 years for phase 3. Added up, that's about 7.5 years. This solely addresses the amount of time that a participant could be involved in the research and doesn't always account for the time it takes to enroll all of the participants. So it can take even longer than that 7.5 years to follow the traditional drug pathway. And typically it usually does take much longer than that 7.5 years. And I think from my perspective, this can be one of the most frustrating parts of clinical research from an outsider's view, in that only 7% of drugs developed go to the FDA for approval, and that it is a very long process to get there. However, it's good to note that these phases and how the system is set up provides a way to weed out treatments that might have too many safety risks or ones that do not have a therapeutic benefit. So depending on the phase and the drug, other features of the clinical trial need to be considered. I'm going to focus on the most common so that we can talk about common terminology. And these are placebo, blinding, and randomization. And first, I just want to say thanks to the Muscular Dystrophy Association. I used some of these graphics from their website, and so wanted to just note that these are taken from the Muscular Dystrophy Association website. So to show if a drug is effective, it needs to have something to compare it to. And there are a lot of different ways to approach this, but the most common is to use a placebo. A placebo is an inactive substance, some call it a sugar pill, that is given to patients in place of a medication. So during a placebo-controlled clinical trial, one group of participants, known as the control group, is given a placebo, while the other group is given the drug being studied. So in the picture on the screen here, the red pill would be the drug being provided. The green circle would be the placebo. And so the people highlighted in green are those that would receive the placebo, and the people highlighted in red would be those that would be given the drug. So using this study design, researchers can compare the therapeutic effects of a drug against the effects of a substance that has no medicinal activity. And really what they're trying to show is the drug better than placebo or better than giving nothing at all? There are also trials where it's not ethical to provide no treatment. This is especially the case if a treatment already exists. So there can be active controlled trials where the potential new study drug is compared to a drug that is already approved or to the standard of care. So once a researcher understands what the comparator will be, they need to consider who will know what treatment a participant is on, and that's called blinding. So there can be open label trials where everyone, the participant, the investigator, or the lead doctor at the clinical trial site, both know the treatment assignment. This picture depicts an open label study, And here you'll see that the investigator or lead doctor is the yellow person up at the top right here. And then she is fully colored in. She knows what is treatment and what is placebo. And also, each individual person knows what they got. They know if they received treatment or they know if they received placebo. There can also be a single blind trial in which only the investigators conducting the study know which treatment the participants are receiving. That's denoted here as the doctor is in full color in yellow, but now all of the participants are shaded in that yellow and gray crosshatch. The participants will not be given the information on what they received until after the trial is over in order to minimize the possibility of unrelated factors affecting the study outcomes. I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. And finally, there can be double-blind trials in which neither the investigator conducting the study nor the participants know which treatment the participants are receiving until after the trial is over. So here you'll see that both the doctor and the participants are shaded and neither know who is receiving what. So a placebo is used in order to be able to measure how a drug works, or if the drug is better than placebo. One reason that placebos are given in a blinded way is due to the placebo effect, a phenomenon where some people experience a benefit after the administration of a placebo. So while a placebo has no effect on the illness, it can have a very real effect on how people feel. And the strength of this effect depends on a variety of factors. But some things that can influence the placebo effect are the nature of the illness or the clinical measure that's being used to show if the treatment is working. So if the study is using a subjective measure like a patient or a physician-reported outcome, that can be swayed by the person's perception of what they receive. However, if the study is using an objective measure, like a laboratory value, it is then difficult to change that measure based on someone's thought of the treatment they are on. Additionally, the placebo effect could be influenced by how strongly the patient believes the treatment will work, the type of response the patient expects to see, and the type of messages a doctor conveys about the treatment's effectiveness. So it's important to use a placebo or some type of comparator so that people's influence or what people think would happen in the trial minimizes the results of the outcome of the study. So knowing the type of comparator arms, as well as who will know what, will support how the trial is conducted. Additionally, a key feature of the trial is randomization. So a clinical trial that is randomized is one in which participants are randomly assigned to either placebo or drug treatment groups. Randomization minimizes the difference among the groups by equally distributing people with particular characteristics across the treatment arms. So with randomization, assignment is by chance. It's not controlled by anyone else. It's not controlled by you. It's not controlled by the doctor or the investigator. And that's because it helps get reliable answers to questions. So if researchers or if investigators got to decide, they might unintentionally choose what patient received which drug, and they might unintentionally bias themselves. So that means that they might, if a patient comes in and is a bit sicker or a bit worse, the doctor might be more willing or might want to give them the new treatment instead of the standard of care. And that could make the two groups different. You can then inherently have one group who is more advanced in their disease than another, or which would hurt the chances of being able to really understand what the treatment effect is. So this would make it harder to say that the differences between the two treatment arms was solely because of the treatment and not because of the differences in the people in the groups. So you want to make sure that the differences are due to the drug, not because of differences in the population or in characteristics of those in the treatment groups. So randomization helps make groups more similar. Therefore, it's kind of similar to our saying of comparing apples to apples. Randomization helps group the individuals so you are comparing apples to apples in your trial. Randomization and blinding are used in clinical trials so that the results will allow researchers to best understand the effect of the treatment. And these are key terms in clinical research. And if interested in participating, ones that you will see or hear often. So it's important to know if you or a loved one decides to participate in a clinical trial. However, the question still remains of should I participate? And I'm going to say this is an incredibly personal decision, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. Some people participate to play a more active role in their own healthcare. Others do it to gain access to new research treatments before they're widely available. And still some want to help others by contributing to medical research. But there are risks to clinical research as well, and they should definitely be weighed in your decision. There may be unpleasant, serious, and sometimes life-threatening side effects to treatments. The treatment may not be effective for you, and the protocol may require more time and attention than a non-protocol treatment would. This can include additional trips to the study site, more treatments, additional hospital stays, or keeping up with complex dosing assignments or requirements. So a family member of mine was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer several years ago. There were some treatment options available. However, none had a very high success rate. So as a family, we did consider clinical trials. In the case of my family member, the person did successfully participate in a randomized trial where the control arm was the standard of care, and luckily is now in remission. However, the success of the trial was not guaranteed. So it took a lot of conversations within the family and with doctors to fully commit to participation. So if you or a loved one is contemplating participation, here are some steps to consider. First is finding a trial. So your primary care physician, your specialists, or others on your medical team might be able to help. So it's always good to talk to your doctor, and I cannot stress that enough. Please talk to your doctor if you're considering clinical trial participation. You can also research what trials are out there yourself by going to clinicaltrials.gov, which I've linked here in the presentation, to look for research that's being conducted. So what you can do is type in your condition or disease in the condition or disease field, and then search for trials all over the world. Now, I am going to say that clinicaltrials.gov is an excellent resource, but it is not the easiest to navigate, as it contains all trials that have been conducted, not just those that are ongoing. However, you can filter. So once you click this search button, once you type in your disease or condition and click search, you will see a list of studies. And on the left-hand side of the screen, there will be some filtering options. And I've put a screenshot of a couple of the filtering options that you have. So you can find trials that are not yet recruiting or currently recruiting to know which are current, those that or which are currently accepting new participants. You can also filter by study type and study phase, which we've talked both about today. So part of clinicaltrials.gov will also provide some information on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. As I said earlier, trials are conducted under controlled environments called protocols. So eligibility to participate in a clinical trial is based on certain criteria. These criteria are determined as part of the clinical trial plan with the goal of recruiting patients in the target population for the drug that's being investigated. Sometimes the criteria can be very narrow, resulting in the recruitment of patients with very few differences. This allows researchers to pick up on very subtle signals that let them know if a drug is working. Inclusion criteria are characteristics that you must have to be included in the study. Common example is having the condition or disease that is being researched. Exclusion criteria are characteristics that disqualify you from inclusion in the study. And examples could be your age, your length of time of diagnosis, or the current schedule of drugs and treatments that you have. So clinicaltrials.gov will have some very basic criteria here for you to search, but also if you click on a study, it will have more information about the criteria. So if you find a trial on your own, as I said before, it's really good to ask your doctors for more information, get their thoughts and opinions. On each study site's website on clinicaltrials.gov, there will also be a list of sites that you can contact to get more information on that specific trial as needed. Also, clinicaltrials.gov allows you to look for only trials that are close to you. So once you click that search button on the homepage, it will take you to a list of all the of all the studies that are ongoing. And those can be found in this list tab here. It will take you clinicaltrials.gov will take you immediately to this list tab. But there's also this tab called On Map. This will show you the trials by country. And I've taken a screenshot of the trials for Canada and the US, but you can look for trials across the globe if needed. By clicking on the US here, this 110, you will then see this map of clinical trials conducted by state. You can then click on the state to get information about specific trials that are close to you. As I said, it's not necessarily the easiest to navigate, but you can find the information. So if you find a trial that you feel you might be interested in and you want to see if you're eligible, you can attend what's called a screening visit. The site will have you come in and first sign an informed consent document. Remember that the main purpose of a clinical trial is to study a new medical treatment. So a clinical trial is first and foremost an experiment. To make an informed decision about whether to participate in a clinical trial, you need to understand the purpose of the research, including what your role will be and how the trial will work. You then decide whether or not to sign the document, and that's known as informed consent. Risks and potential benefits will be explained to you in the informed consent process. So you should read the document carefully and ask questions about any information you do not understand. And I want to specifically highlight the asking questions piece. You should know as much as possible about the clinical trial and feel comfortable asking the members of your healthcare team questions about the trial, the care expected while in the trial, and the cost of the trial to you. I've put some questions that the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation, or CISCRP, I've put some of the questions that they have on their website. These questions are really important to ask and are a great starting list for questions that might come up when you're talking about clinical research with your doctors, the clinical care team, or with the site themselves. Questions like, what's the purpose of this study? Why do researchers believe the new treatment being tested could be effective? Has it been tested before? Definitely questions about who will pay for the treatment and if you'll be reimbursed for other expenses. It's very important to understand before making the commitment. Knowing about the long-term follow-up care and then how you will get the results of the study. Additionally, after reading the informed consent, you're likely to have other questions specifically related to that informed consent document. These questions can be, I'm not sure what this specific risk means or what this specific term means. Can you please explain that to me? If you are wondering if this drug has been tested before, you might also want to ask, what were the results? If you are wondering if you can continue with your standard of care, you might also want to ask, can you continue with your standard of care? And if you have to stop your standard of care, what are the risks involved with that? And in addition to the reimbursement question on if you will get paid for your expenses and for the treatment, another question is also how long you'll be on site for each type of visit. It's important to have all of that to clearly understand what's going on, what the expectations are of you, and what you should expect going into the trial. So if considering participation, you can ask to review the informed consent prior to even going to the site for this screening visit. Or you have to know that you do not have to sign right away. You can ask for time, you can take it home and review it with who's ever in your trusted circle, whether that be family, friends, or medical team. Additionally, you can use clinicaltrials.gov to see if any studies were already completed and ongoing, and if there's any data around them. So when my family member was considering participation, I sat down and reviewed the ICF as well and wrote down a list of questions that I had about the study. My family member then asked the medical team about those questions, got responses, and we discussed what the responses were. And also I looked on clinicaltrials.gov to understand what other trials used this new treatment, where the pharmaceutical company was in the development cycle, to understand a little bit more about how many people have received the treatment thus far. If you enroll in a clinical trial, you're going to be expected to adhere to taking the trial medication according to the prescribed dosage and schedule. You'll be expected to report your side effects or any unexpected events that happened, maintain your own health, and discuss with your clinical trial team any significant changes in your life. So it's a commitment, and sometimes it can be a time-consuming one. So it's important to make sure your questions are answered. While the ICF is presented at the beginning of the trial, it is not a one-time thing. You have the right to withdraw your consent at any time. When withdrawing from a trial, if you need to, you should always let the research team know about it and the reason for leaving the study, because this could make an impact on the experience of others throughout the trial. So I did just want to say that this presentation was meant to be an introduction to clinical trials. And I hope that this talk today provided you with a bit more information on clinical trials and the things you need to know if you're considering participation. So I do thank you for attending, and looking at the time, I think, Lauren, we should likely move on to your presentation if that's okay. And then during the panel discussion, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Sounds great.
Okay. Then I'm first going to introduce Lauren Dunlap. Lauren Dunlap is the Executive Director for AAIDA and has always had a passion for advocacy and helping others. Lauren received her Bachelor's of Arts degree from Belmont Abbey College and has over 10 years experience in advocating for rare disease patients and maneuvering the ins and outs of the prior authorization process. Lauren also spends time with lawmakers on Capitol Hill during specific advocacy days to voice patient concerns on topics such as access to medications and care, healthcare reform issues, and other important topics in the patient community. To continue her patient advocacy efforts, Lauren obtained certification with the Accreditation Council of Medical Affairs as a Prior Authorization Certification Specialist, or PACS, in order to help patients better understand the prior authorization process with insurance companies. Lauren's eager to share her knowledge with patients and physicians on ways to speed up the PA process and eliminate the headache and burden that it brings to all involved.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. And I just want to say this, this talk, Megan and I have been, this is a long time coming. Are so excited that we finally got to do it after about a year of planning and then COVID occurring. So one thing before I dive into the tricks and hacks for navigating the prior authorization process that I actually thought of while Megan was doing her talk was clinical trials and insurance coverage while patients are in clinical trials. So I wanted to sideline that item for our Q&A at the end of towards the end, but I thought that would be also an interesting question and topic. So again, my name is Lauren Dunlap, and I am a prior authorization certification specialist and also executive director and co-founder for AAIDA. Prior to obtaining my certification in 2020, I had been doing my own or at least expediting my own prior authorizations for my specific specialty medication, which is extremely expensive. It's called IVIG, or intravenous immunoglobulin, for over a decade. And I knew that teaching the patients about the prior authorization process, or during this talk, I might mention PA, that in lieu of prior authorization, is important because then they can teach other patients how to expedite this as well. And this picture right here, I kind of picked it because it looks so nice and relaxing on the beach. You could just sit on and have not a care in the world and have your little cocktail in your hand. And I really wanted a relaxing picture to kick us off because this particular topic just causes so much anxiety and stress for so many people, and that's kind of why I picked that background. So and I don't have any disclosures, by the way. Nobody's paying me to do this. I really want to do this on my own so I can teach patients how to conduct this in a better way. So the first thing I want to say is, like, what is a prior authorization, or PA? And it is any process by which physicians and other healthcare providers must obtain advance approval from a health plan before a specific service is delivered to the patient to qualify for payment coverage. And that could come in the form of medications, medical devices, medical services, etc. And what I would like to do is play a really quick 2-minute video that kind of explains what the PA process is. It's really quick. Don't have any sound.
Okay, hold on and let me see if I can fix something for the audio.
No problem. At least we have script at the bottom. And this is also on the AMA, American Medical Association's website, or the AMA, for this video.
Can you hear it now, Lauren?
No. Well, it's okay. At least we have the script, Megan.
Okay.
Okay, so you can, thank you. Sorry about the audio, a little hiccup there. You can go to, this is actually on YouTube, and you can go to the AMA, like it says at the bottom, .org/prior authorization to rewatch the video. And some of those numbers in the short little video there are actually even higher now, because I think that particular video was based off of data from 2016, I think I remember. So basically, what about the patients and all this prior authorization mess? And I have to ask the question, how many of you have had a delay in treatment or know someone who has had a delay in treatment due to an issue with a PA or the PA process? And how's your experience been with that? Why are they required? At the bottom line deal is all about cost. And this is always something I usually ask patients too, is do they personally know how much their specific medication or procedure, device, whatever it may be, cost, or even their out-of-pocket costs for the year for their medication with the insurance company? Because those numbers are kind of important to keep in mind. And I was also going to remind folks, um, you can type in the box, we'll get to your questions in a bit, but was wondering if anybody knew their cost of their medication they may be getting that requires a prior authorization, and would they be willing to share that with us? And again, you can type it in the box, and we just can discuss that during the Q&A if you're okay with sharing. So now, the question is, can the patient help their physician or pharmacy expedite obtaining a PA for a medication or procedure? Well, there is good news. And that is a big yes, that you can. And so we're going to kind of switch around this picturesque scenery and head to the mountains, because, you know, in my mind, metaphorically, the PA process is just a mountain of a challenge, and you always are going to be going uphill. So I figured we could have some relaxing scenery going uphill. But the good news is you can help advocate for yourself. And the bigger question on that end is, where do you start in this process? So let us dive into where to start. And now, in the background of that picture, that is the lovely maroon bells in Aspen, Colorado. You never get tired of looking at them. And this is my number one tip of anybody I ever meet, no matter what, is document everything. And I mean everything. Um, if you don't know how or have never started, now is the time to learn and just go ahead and dive in. I didn't have a clue in the world um, 11, 12 years ago, all the ins and outs of this. And then I got to understanding the importance of the documentation aspect. So every um, every interaction you have on the phone in regards to getting a PA, you document it, whether it be with the insurance company, the pharmacy, doctor's office, whatever it may be, write it down. And you want to write down the dates, times, who you spoke to, what they said, all the little teeny tiny details, or as I call it, fine print, and hang on to that paper and store it in a safe place where you will not forget it, because you may have to go through multiple channels, so you want it easily accessible as a future reference in case it does occur, and you can go to it exactly, know exactly where it is and get it. And I'm just going to warn you that the PA process itself is not easy, but and it can be lengthy, but you just want to hang on to that paper, and you'll know why here in a bit. I do want to just include a short personal story of when I specifically had a delay in treatment. And I think it was, I forgot, it's 21. So it's probably been like 6 or 7 years ago, with a PA request, and the medication I received through an IV every 3 weeks, which I mentioned was called IVIG. And the delay that the insurance company that delay cost them actually more money by denying the prior authorization than it would have if they had approved the PA in a timely manner. So they denied the PA because I had just, after the initial request, because I had just recently switched insurance companies. And this particular insurance company, even though I had been on IVIG for, at that point, I think 5 or 6 years already, decided to not deny it or delay it, and they didn't think I needed it. Well, because my treatment was delayed, I ended up getting pneumonia, and so that's when I go back and I said it cost them more money, because they have to pay for not only the IVIG medication that they denied in the first place, but also the medication and treatments for my pneumonia that I got because they delayed it. Not only did it cost them money, but the most important aspect of this is it cost me time and recovery, and also money, because I couldn't work until I was better. And if you've ever had pneumonia, it's a good while before you're back to your normal self. And that's not okay to put anyone through, when you could have been ultimately prevented just by simply, just by the insurance company listening to me and my physician at the time to expedite this process. So that was incredibly frustrating to deal with. And again, that's just one little example I like to share with people on that. So let's dive into a little bit more details. And we're going to go back to grammar school actually for this one, and get the who, what, when, where, why, and how. So this is going to tie into previous slides discussing the documentation piece. So again, the first question you want to ask is, who did you speak to? Get their name and the company they work for, whoever you're calling, whether it be the insurance company or the pharmacy or doctor's office. Who did you speak to? Next one, what did they tell you, or what channels did they say you needed to go through to resolve any issues? And write it down very specifically as what they said, because again, you might have to come back to that document. And when did you speak to them? You need to write down the date and the time zone that you're in. When is this going to be resolved is also an important follow-up question, and the projected deadline. If you don't hear anything about like between 48 to 72 hours or 2 to 3 business days, then you probably want to follow up with the same person you spoke to and get their direct extension if possible, because that's not always the case when you're calling in a 1-800 number to a large insurance company. They don't generally have their direct extensions. So where did they say you were, or the physician or pharmacy was in the PA process, and what are the next steps? Ask any kind of question that you might think will be necessary later. And why, the why part is tell them why you are calling. Tell them this is urgent. And we're going to get into more detail on that on the next slide here in a minute. But it's very good to put a human face on and not just be a number. And that's kind of leading into the how, the last one. Tell them how this is affecting you or your loved one. The delay in treatment can be detrimental and sometimes life-threatening. Like the example that I just gave in my particular case, if we hadn't got that pneumonia under control, it could have been a lot worse. But if you put a real face and name on yourself, like I just said, and then you're just not a number at an insurance office calling. And you might have some kind of connection with whoever the person you're speaking to. And that's always important in this entire process. There was a specific example I was going to give, and I can come back to it in a minute, that occurred 2 years ago that had to do with this. And I remember now. So there was, again, another short story about a PA process I had to deal with. Again, trying to get my IVIG with the insurance, and it basically sat on this guy's desk at the insurance company. And I would call every couple of days because there was only a 3-week time period in between my treatments. And I'd call him and not get him, or I'd get somebody else, and they're like, yeah, he's working on it. And then I had to eventually call a different person. Then I started to put my name and why this was important to me and how this is going to affect me. And it significantly expedited the process. And they got that prior authorization in so quickly, because after I sat them down and said, this is why it's important. I wasn't just another name, like I said. And this lady was like, oh my gosh, yes, I understand why now this is important. And she quickly did something about it, along with getting it on a move. So let us go to the next slide, and that the item I just mentioned, number 2, and requesting an urgent prior authorization. So you need to know your rights as a patient. And most patients, there are some providers too, just don't know you have the right to request an urgent PA. And the insurance has to answer you within 48 to 72 hours or 2 to 3 business days if you make this request as the policyholder and as the patient. There have been very few instances where I've asked this to be done and it wasn't complete. And if you remember the first tip that I went over, the document everything, you all remember that, I hope, because that's like number 1. I did. I've been doing this a while. So I went back to my documentation sheet and who I'd spoken to, and I had to make more phone calls, right? since it's often difficult to get the same person, as I mentioned, as you may have spoken to previously, I started listing the 5 W's off to the person I spoke to on this last time. And then after that, what really makes them jump is when I say, I've already requested a urgent review. And if it has not been taken care of, you are supposed to make a decision within 72 hours or 48 hours and get back to me or my physician or pharmacy, because I know my rights. That makes the insurance companies a little bit nervous when you know your rights as a patient, and they'll act more quickly at that moment or as soon as they get off the phone with you. And I had that also occur several years ago, when I had to say that to the person. And I'm telling you what, she got off that phone and that prior authorization was approved about, I don't know, an hour or two later, as soon as I got off the phone and mentioned that to her, the person I spoke to at the insurance company. So, but you really need to know the language, and that language right there on tip number 2, requesting an urgent prior authorization, is key. All right, let's go on to the next slide. And this is kind of new. So the ONC's Cures Act, and so physicians, hospitals, and other healthcare providers must have a policy for this new requirement in place for the Cures Act by April the 5th of this year. And what does this actually mean for a patient? And it's actually a good thing, because these are just 3 simple items that are important for this particular talk and educating you about this new Cures Act. It's the ease of accessing records, protecting privacy and security, and ability to shop for care and manage costs. And I just want to click on this little site and show you what this actually entails. And you can go online to get more details on the ONC's Cures Act at the website, and I can also send that to you if you have questions. But this is going to be a really good thing for patients, and I want to kind of go over and break this down to better understand and for each of the 3 items that I mentioned and what this means for patients. So if we can go back to the slide over here, and the first one is ease of accessing records. So the ONC's Cures Act final rule supports a patient's control of their health care and their medical record through smartphones or any modern software apps. And there's going to be no more blocking of medical records at all. So for nearly all, when you hear the term EHI, it stands for electronic health information. And so for nearly all EHI requests, physicians must respond and release patient medical records unless an appropriate exception can be identified and used. And I just want to touch base on what does that mean? What is information blocking, and what does that mean? And I want to go over to the AMA website again, and it's going to give you, it's going to give you a list and examples of what information blocking is and what those exceptions are if there is information blocking occurring. So this PDF has been really helpful, because again, this is new information, and it's kind of lengthy, so I won't go over all of it, but I like the fact that it does show what examples are of the information blocking. And so number 2, go back to my screen over here, is protecting privacy and security. And the rule supports secure patient access to the patient's electronic medical record data. And the patient will be able to use applications they authorize to receive data from their medical records, which is another really good added feature. Number 3 is the ability to shop for for care and manage cost. So the ONC's Cures Act final rule looks to expand patient and payer choice in healthcare by increasing the availability of data that can support insights about care quality and cost. So basically, it's going to give more transparency to cost and services provided to patients. And it probably sounds like I'm, rattling on, and you're probably asking why are you telling me this? What's this have to do with helping me to learn how to get a PA completed more quickly? But this is pretty new information, and I wanted to tell you about this so that you're aware, because it's going to help you significantly as a patient to access your electronic health record more easily, and also help with the burden of the PA process and requests, especially since they're eliminating information blocking, and that also will help you to obtain records to expedite a PA process as well. So if we go to the next slide, there is big changes with CMS change and for this year regarding PAs, which was just announced a little over a month ago. And I'm going to go over what those are on this next slide. Well, several of them that are important to this particular talk. So a few proposed requirements for payers include build and maintain a document requirement lookup service, API, within the electronic health record to help identify the prior authorization requirements of specific payers. Publicly share data about their PA process. For instance, sharing of PA requests that are approved, denied, and approved following appeal, and the average time between when a request is made and a determination. Offer a specific reason for a denial of a PA request to facilitate better communication and understanding the provider and payer. And this requirement would stand regardless of the method used to request the PA. And that basically means there's various ways you can, that a physician could request a PA, and that could be through a fax, phone, or email. Those are the three, and they can also do snail mail, but that's kind of irrelevant now. The fastest way is email now. So I will just say I can appreciate the little orange box because I want to know the why to everything. And if anybody knows me, I ask why about, everything. So I want to know why it was denied so that I can prevent this from occurring again, or where the breakdown was in the process. And I know I don't have time to do this multiple times because it does take hours and hours to do if you start adding up the minutes that you're on hold or you're talking to somebody and then you have to get transferred to the next person and next person. And frankly, I don't have time to do it, and neither do you or your healthcare provider. So let me just tell me the facts of why of it all. And so there's a few more proposed requirements that CMS is proposing in order to make the PA process more accessible to patients, healthcare providers, and payers alike. So some of the other reasons that I just really wanted to briefly go over, besides these three that are on the screen, are sending PA decisions within 72 hours for an urgent request and 7 days for standard request, which means like quality health plan issues on the fees for service exchange are accepted. So the 72 hours is already a thing if you use the correct language in the process, like we discussed earlier, and using the term urgent, requesting urgent PA. But the 7-day requirement is a new addition, and I have to say, like, it's a great addition because now patients aren't waiting days and weeks for an answer on whether the PA was approved or not. I'm sure everybody that's tuned in today at some point has had that happen to them. Another one is build and maintain a fast healthcare interoperability resource electronic enabled prior authorization support patient access application program interfaces. That was a mouthful, and I'll tell you in a minute what it means. To send and receive PA requests electronically within their established workflow while following HIPAA transaction standards. And what does that mean? Because that was quite a sentence I just read. So basically, that paragraph meant the payers or insurance companies have to build a program that will streamline requests for PAs while still maintaining HIPAA compliance. This is actually not going into effect until January 2023 to implement that particular piece of it. So they still have some time to build those programs. There is, I was trying to think, there was another, well, sorry, I'll skip that one. So those are just, again, highlighted pieces that I wanted to share with you that have just now recently taken into been implemented as in this year. So there are some, CMS also wants to issue 5 requests for information and or advice on the following. And I won't read over this entire, you can kind of scan it. I don't want to read it word for word, but in regards to several things on the screen, and sharing patient health information, there are certain rules in place when regards to that, and mainly affects behavioral health and mental health records, including substance use treatment, which is its own entity when it comes to sharing information on specific things with HIPAA. And that also will require, ties into the PA process with these new requirements as well. Sorry, just trying to, lost my place. Insights into the potential benefits of establishing 7, again, that's a big long word, fast healthcare interoperability resources, electronic enabled prior authorization support patient platform, and specifications for exchanging healthcare information. That's going to be a lot of tech things that will be implemented later. I just, again, wanted to touch base on that. I'm not going to dive into a lot of detail on that. So I'm gonna go on to the next screen because I really want to kind of discuss briefly the key takeaways of this talk. And again, this talk is just supposed to be a crash course in expediting the PA process. And it's not an all-exclusive list, but I did want to share some newer information on this as well. So one of the key takeaways, number one, even though it is so frustrating, I know this, I've lived it for years and years, is to never give up. However, you have to stay vigilant no matter how hard it is and with your efforts. And number two, document everything. Make sure you document items no matter how tedious it may seem. Use sites like, yeah, I'm sorry. The document key is everything. So this next part is stay abreast to the latest developments and laws pertaining to PAs and EMRs. I have specific sites that I go to that are very reliable in information and resources that are always up to date with this. And this is really important because if we go back to the previous screen or 2 screens, those new rules were I just got news of them. Like I think what said December the 10th is one of the articles I was reading. And so I would have never actually probably found that out if I hadn't been diving into different resources and keeping abreast to that information that is available. So another quick personal story is I'm about to do this exact PA process again in 2 weeks with my insurance, which changes in 2 weeks on the 1st. And because my treatment falls on the exact week my insurance changes, I'm going to have to request an urgent PA. So since the insurance companies like to drag their feet on these types of things, and I don't have time for a delay in treatment or get another bout of pneumonia during a pandemic either, and no one does on that end. um that's the key takeaway here is I have to remember my own advice and the key takeaways of not to give up even though it's frustrating, and document everything, and also stay abreast to the develop the latest developments in PAs. And I know I am a couple minutes shy of getting our panel discussion, and I can't wait to read all these questions that were coming in and that we all have. So if we're going to go into a few minutes early the questions with our panelists, and I would also like to mention that I would like this next session to be the Q&A to be more of a fireside chat in a way, and an open discussion between our panel and the attendees on the line, because we love to have you interact with us. So please ask questions, as many as you want, in the box panel and our interactions with the attendees. So I'm going to um, tell you about our next speaker, Miss Tonya Winders. And so Miss Tonya Winders is CEO and president of Allergy and Asthma Network, and has more than 20 years of experience in leadership roles within the allergy and asthma industry, from sales and marketing leadership to managing markets access. She has worked tirelessly to ensure patients have access to effective diagnostic and treatment tools. Tonya serves on several expert panels, including Precision and the American Thoracic Society Public Advisory Roundtable. She is one of the board of directors of the American Respiratory Care Foundation, and is the current president of the Global Allergy and Airways Patient Platform, or GAP, representing more than 50 respiratory patient organizations throughout the world. While patient-focused, GAP works in concert with healthcare professionals, researchers, and scientists, industry, and government to further the aspirations of people with asthma and allergies. Tonya also became the first patient advocate member for Global Initiative for Asthma, or GINA. Tonya is passionate about her work and is a fierce patient advocate who overcame cancer 16 years ago, enjoys spending time with her husband and cheering on her children in various sports. So welcome Tonya as the moderator to this Q&A session that we are going to have. And I already
Thank you, Lauren.
had.
Thank you. And it's my pleasure to be with you guys today. Certainly excited to listen into the presentation that Megan and Lauren presented to you all today. So when I check out the questions here, the first question is around the price transparency rule that was passed through Congress. And the question comes from Courtney, and she says, will the price transparency rule passed through Congress also assist this? So I'm not sure. Megan, would you like to take that one, or Lauren?
Tonya, you kind of cut out there at the end, and it didn't finish. We couldn't hear you. Can you just repeat
Okay.
the question for us?
So the question was, will the price transparency rule passed through Congress assist with PA process?
Hmm. I might have to come back to that one because I'm not sure right now. I will tell you, I don't know. I might have to look it up. Unless Tonya, do you know the answer to that question?
Off the top of my head, I do not believe it does, actually. The rule is much more around transparent drug pricing and why certain drugs are priced in the way that they are, as well as limiting increases in those on those prices over time. So to my knowledge, there's nothing in that price transparency rule that really is specific to the prior authorization process per se.
Okay. Thank you, Tonya.
All right.
Um,
You want me to go to the next one?
sure.
So the next question comes from David, and he says, is there a fixed protocol or set of guidelines for sample size when creating and conducting studies for DA?
Oh, Tanya, you cut out a little bit there. I heard, is there a fixed sample size for studies conducting, and then it went out.
Conducting studies for DME, durable medical equipment.
So sample size is something that researchers and pharmaceutical companies are going to think carefully of. And there's not a set of rules in terms of sample size because it all depends on what the primary endpoint or what the primary objective of the trial is. And based on that and the what's called an effect size, which really just means what you're thinking the treatment or the intervention will do, and the amount of the effect it will have, that's going to determine what type of sample size you have. So if you are expecting a very large difference between standard of care or placebo, you're likely going to need a smaller number of patients. If you're thinking that the effect that the product will have is small to moderate, you might need more patients to be able to truly show that the treatment or the intervention is actually having an effect on your body. So there's no hard set rule. It is a little bit dependent on the indication you're in as well as what the intervention is.
Great, thank you, Megan. And I also know that FDA does have a section on their site specifically about recommendations for sample size for DME. So I think I've put that in the response here for David, who asked the question.
Great, thanks.
The next question comes around the cost, the average cost to complete phase 1 to phase 5 FDA approval. So let's say for a new drug to get to market, what's the average cost?
Ooh, that is a tough question. It is a large number. I just read this recently, and I'm blanking on the number, but I can pull it up quickly. But it is.
I'll bail you out here, Megan, because I actually just looked this up. So it's $1 billion in 10 years.
I was about to say it's going to be in the billions. I just didn't know how many billions to state.
So it's like $1 billion in 10 years is the average. One of the more expensive ones that I'm aware of was about 2.7 billion and about a 12-year process. So yeah, it's definitely costly on time and money.
Just a couple of pennies.
No, and it, and that is for the ones that go the duration. You have to remember kind of those percentages that were shown before. And, there's a lot of money also in the drugs that end up not working. Either they're not efficacious or they present far too many safety concerns and risks to the participants or the intended population. And so, that's just for the drugs that are going to approval, not necessarily all drug
Megan,
development.
Right, Megan, would you mind hitting the next slide that shows the panelists?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Thank you. Appreciate it. There was, I wanted to kind of touch on something that you just said based on this, and I'm sure you both will probably comment on this, but what's the best way to get funding for a company to get funding for this process? You know, how did they get that money to do that? I mean, that's a lot of money. That's like $1 billion over 10 years. I was just curious.
Most of the
So
time it's through venture capitalists, Series A funding that comes from different sources, or the big pharma companies, again, they have that shareholder value, and certainly have a pipeline that is working through the process with many different molecules simultaneously. So it's sort of the old adage of the more money you have, the more money you make. It's very difficult for startup companies to, raise this type of capital and investment, a new product or a new drug forward.
yeah, Tanya, you're exactly right. I think the larger pharmas, they are using the money that they're making on their approved products to support the research. Smaller companies, the good thing is that the phase 1 studies are the shortest in duration and tend to be the cheapest. So it's really when you start moving on to those phase 3, late stage 2, phase 3 studies that are more expensive. So it gives time for the smaller companies, the biotechs, the new startups to start getting funding through venture capitalists, but also it doesn't all need to be generated at once. But I think that's where, there's a lot of conferences, a lot of venture capitalists conferences where people go and present the results from their phase 1 or from interim analyses of phase 2 so that they can generate more capital to spend on their drug development programs.
Nice.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. So our next question comes around prior authorizations. Is there anything specific that should be included in prior auths?
Well, it actually depends on what you're getting the prior auth done for. So there's medications, medical devices, procedures. I geared my presentation more toward the medication side of things and specialty pharmacy. It honestly, that is kind of a loaded question because it really depends on a lot of things. So the physician or the pharmacist has to also, there's so many CPT or diagnostic codes that are involved. There's also information pertaining to if one medication, if you have failed on a medication and you're trying a new product, sometimes that has to be noted. There, there's so many ins and outs of that particular question. So if Courtney, if you wanted to be more specific with what you are looking for, it really depends. So there are things that the doctor has to include in the order before submitting the prior authorization. And then also the pharmacy and insurance companies have to have protocols that they have to do. And if the doctor sends over the prior auth without supporting documentation, it could be denied. And that's where your question, is there anything specific that should be included in that prior auth? That's where that would come up, because the insurance might say, hey, Dr. Jones, you didn't include this, so this prior authorization is denied. If that helps. I mean, Tonya, did you want to follow up on anything with that one answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, I think there are some pretty standard aspects of prior authorization. I mean, your personal information, of course, your diagnosis code. Likely, if you're trying to get a prior auth, it's because it's on a new product, so you've likely failed other products. So a bit of that history and justification for why you need to be on the product that you're requesting that prior auth for. If it's a renewal, then oftentimes it's how long you've been on the product, why you need to continue on the product, and more of that flavor. So it really is case dependent, and unfortunately there's no uniformity around the prior authorization. So we have passed bills in certain states that require all insurance companies in that state PA form, and we're trying to get that to be universal across the board because there are over 5,000 health insurers in the US. And so you
Wow.
can imagine 5,000 health insurers or health insurance plans. That means 5,000 different prior authorization forms and a lot of confusion for patients and providers. So this is one of the things that we've been advocating for is more uniformity in that process.
Yes, definitely needs to happen. Um, one thing, Megan, I was touching base on this when you were finishing up, was to touch on when a patient gets involved with a clinical trial and they have commercial insurance. And I figured you and Tonya could probably both touch on that because that gets iffy too sometimes.
It it does. And so federal law does require that most health insurance plans, and I think the most is what needs to be bolded, it requires that most health insurance plans cover routine patient care costs in clinical trials, assuming that you're eligible for the trial and that it's an approved trial, which mainly means it's run, it's federally sanctioned, so run by the NIH, or it has went through the process of called an IND, an investigational new drug application, which is basically a company letting the FDA know and getting FDA buy-in that this treatment should be, this intervention should be have research conducted in humans. So assuming that it's, an approved clinical trial, they'll pay for routine patient care costs. So that really means that your health plan aren't required to cover research costs. So if it includes extra blood tests than standard, or additional scans that are basically just for research purposes, the health plan doesn't need to cover those. Often, the sponsor of the trial will cover those costs, but it's really important to have those conversations earlier. The other thing has to be with where the clinical trial is being conducted, right? So if your plan doesn't cover the cost of out-of-network doctors or out-of-network hospitals, then they don't, if your plan does not cover that, then your plan does not need to cover that for the clinical trial. But if your plan does cover out-of-network hospitals and doctors, then they have to cover the costs if you take part in the clinical trial. So it's understanding your insurance, it's understanding how the trial was set up, but really understanding your insurance plan and talking to your insurance company, whether you or your physician or one of the medical staff at the clinical site. It's best to get that information early so you understand what your insurance will cover, what the sponsor will cover, so you have a better idea of if there will be any out-of-pocket costs.
Yes, that's Tonya, did you want to add anything to that?
No, yeah, I really feel like that Megan covered it thoroughly. This is consistent with the patient experience that we've heard from participation in clinical trials as well. I mean, honestly, there never should be a direct cost to you as a patient for participating in a clinical trial. If anything, you should be compensated for your, time and making sure that as appropriate, and also that you don't have additional expense like parking or, as we said before, the routine care cost associated with maintaining the protocol.
Right.
Awesome. Um, I wanted to add that when you were talking about clinicaltrials.gov, Megan,
Hmm.
that that is not an easy
No.
site to maneuver at all. I know that, so I'm glad that you walked through our attendees with this. So I wanted to mention that also on clinicaltrials.gov, you can decipher between clinical trials and clinical studies. I know we're not focused on clinical studies
Hmm.
in this particular webinar, but I was wondering if either one of you wanted to touch base on what the difference is between a clinical trial versus a clinical study, so our attendees would know.
Sure. So clinical trials, as I said, they need an intervention, right? Um, Clinical studies, some people use them interchangeably. So some people mean clinical trial when they say clinical study. Others just talk about any study where a participant needs to sign informed consent, whether or not there's an intervention. So if you look, I'm just going to go up in slides for a bit. And so sorry for the long scroll. But if you look here, it will talk about study type. There's the interventional clinical trial. There's also observational studies. And observational studies are really where you are being followed and just people are understanding the natural course of the disease or the condition, or they're just understanding, it might just be in addition to your routine blood draws, they might collect additional lab samples so that they can see if there's certain genetic components or biomarkers that can be used. But really, they are not infringing on what is standard to the natural course of you going to your doctors. These can also include patient registries. Patient registries can be types of observational trials, but typically they're just talking about um, wanting to get an idea of, who in, the US or the world has a specific disease or condition, get some information about you. But sometimes patient registries are then used that if you sign up and if you provide information, they might then use that to let you know about potential interventional trials that are coming up or other observational trials. The expanded access trials is something completely different and really deals with more of of trials that or basically where one patient or a single patient can potentially get an approved drug or a drug for an emergency situation.
Thanks, Megan, for explaining that
Mhm.
difference.
Yep.
So, Megan,
Sorry.
next question is more for you, and it is, how can people with underlying health conditions get more involved in clinical trials? Because so many times, unfortunately, the way they're designed, those individuals are excluded.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part. And it, depending on the phase of the trial, and also depending on what the pharmaceutical company thinks who would benefit the most from the intervention, that inclusion exclusion criteria can make all of the difference. And you're right, underlying conditions definitely weigh into who is eligible for a study and then what studies you can participate in. And so really, if you're not eligible, it's going to be very difficult to be able to be included in clinical research. But I think talking to your doctor, also talking to, if your doctor's not part of the trial, talking to one of the sites and understanding a little bit more why your underlying condition is an exclusionary factor is useful, because it could be that there is how the drug is metabolized could actually cause you, put you at more risk for potential side effects. Or it could be that how the drug works, it would make your underlying condition would make it less likely to work. So there's usually reasons like that, all based on safety and potential benefit, that go into the inclusion exclusion criteria. So I don't think there's a way to necessarily become more involved. I would just say keep looking for trials and keep having the conversations, because there are likely going to end up being some studies where you then end up being eligible. And usually the earlier on in the phase, the more likely they are to be more restrictive in their entry criteria, because they're trying to understand more about the intervention. They're trying to understand more about how it works in the given population. So it might be that, you know, a
And
couple
they're
of
trying
years
to
down the
eliminate
road.
any and trying to eliminate any confounding factors, right? I mean, they don't
Exactly.
want anything that could perhaps, conflict or confuse the results.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So our next question comes around, how does one decide what type of trial to design? Whether they're looking, we hear this double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized clinical trial.
Yeah.
How is that decision made to do a trial in that fashion versus another?
Yeah, so it's going to come down to several different things, but where they are in the phase, earlier phases, you tend to see more single blind or open label trials, but it also really depends on the severity of the disease and the particular indication. Um, y- you know, if it is a life-threatening disease and there are no other treatment alternatives, um, while the randomized placebo-controlled trials are the gold standard of trials, sometimes they are not used, even in regulatory, even for NDA or the new drug application submissions, because it's just not ethical to um, to provide nothing. Now, you have to remember though is that this is experimental, and while everybody goes in hoping that the drug will have some effect or the intervention will have some effect, it's not guaranteed. So you have to be careful with just saying that there shouldn't be placebo, um, because it very well might be that if you gave everybody treatment and the treatment doesn't work, you could be putting more people at risk, right? So it is an experiment. And so the decision for what you're going to do for blinding, for if you're going to randomize, really comes down to how you're going to use the data at the end of the day. As I said, earlier phases tend to be a little bit more relaxed with what they do because they're not going to be they're being used to help them develop the next phase and help them develop more of what their drug development program looks like. When you start getting into phase 2, phase 3, definitely phase 3, they tend to be more randomized, double blind, placebo controlled trials, because you need to present that data and all of those results to the agency to show that your drug worked or your intervention worked. And because of that, you need a little bit more rigor. um, Now, there are always going to be, side cases and excursions from that, but typically, once you get into phase 3, it's going to be double-blind, placebo-controlled.
Great, thank you. So no webinar in this day and age in 2020, 2021 would be complete without a little bit of discussion around COVID. Meagan, help us understand how the COVID vaccine trials have gone so quickly. I mean, we heard earlier 10 years, $1 billion, right?
Yes.
How have they been able to condense that and do it this also?
Sure. So Tanya, you're going out, but I'm pretty sure I caught the gist of the question. So you're right that they have went very quickly. I think first and foremost, it is very important to say that none of the vaccines or the treatments have acquired approval, at least from my understanding. They have all been granted what
Correct.
is called emergency use authorization. And so emergency use authorizations or EUAs are not approvals. Um, they are not, but really what they are temporary authorization by the FDA to use that product because of the country is under either, in this case, a chemical threat, right? Or I'm sorry, a biological threat. It's up against COVID-19. And so EUAs allow the FDA to really help the country um, facilitate availability of the use during healthcare emergencies. So that's first and foremost. None of these have been approved. There are still studies ongoing, even even with those who have EUA. There's still, research being conducted. These studies are still ongoing to look at, long-term safety. So it's not over. But because of the pandemic and because this is considered a healthcare emergency, things got sped up, but also we have to remember that this is not approved. And I think the other thing that people need to understand is these pharmaceutical companies and these biotechs have been working on similar or tangential research for a long time. So there have been studies that have been done with these types of vaccines, maybe not for COVID-19, but for other types of viruses. And so this wasn't for a lot of these companies, especially some who have went so quickly, this isn't, some of their first research. It's some of their first research in COVID-19, but not in vaccines and not in virus control.
So I had a
That is,
question, Megan, for you
go ahead.
with that regards. So if it's not technically approved and they have authorization, is that kind of sitting in its own entity, so to speak?
Yeah.
Like what happens when it finally falls out of limbo?
So so all EUAs will expire. So there will be, and I don't know the expiration that these products currently have, so I can't speak to that. But all EUAs do expire, and when they do expire, they're no longer used for that specific indication until they're approved. I don't know what the timelines are for everything that's been under EUA for COVID, but it is clear, in terms of the laws and what we have, and that all EUAs will expire, and then they will, they can proceed to get approval, or that could be just something that stops in drug development.
Thanks for explaining that.
Mhm.
All right. I think that's pretty much the gist of the questions, Lauren, unless you have something else that you want to put forth to the panel.
Um, well, I did want to mention that a really good resource that the public that is available to the public are the FDA public listening sessions, because they're open to anyone who wants to attend. They can be, obviously, pre-COVID they were in person at the FDA, but now they're online, and you can go to the FDA website and view when the next public listening sessions are taking place, because I just feel like those are very, very educational if you want to learn more about any type of process with the FDA, especially when it comes to new drugs coming onto the market. It's very interesting to be a part of that. So I
Mhm.
have been up there for a couple of the public listening sessions. So just wanted to throw that out there right quick. And also, there was one question, and I don't know if you wanted to touch on this, Megan. Um, since you have AstraZeneca clinical trials of the COVID vaccine, and how does the data that the AstraZeneca vaccine was approved, but then it wasn't approved? Can you touch on how the data was maybe inflated in that particular study, and then they corrected some things? If you're okay with touching on that.
Yeah, so I don't know enough about the specifics to really feel comfortable commenting. So instead, I'll speak in
Yeah.
generalities, right? Throughout clinical research, as I said, you're randomizing because you're hoping that people will be similar between treatment arms. And, that's what randomization is there for. Doesn't always work. And sometimes you will get where different treatment arms have slightly different populations. Or you're looking at everybody in a treatment arm, but really, your drug or your intervention might work for only a subset of them. So your primary endpoint, your primary objective of the study might end up not being what's called statistically significant, or really what that means is that you're not showing a clinical benefit. But you might find a subpopulation that does. And you might have enough data to be able to then say, okay, well, this study didn't show significance. The study didn't show the drug worked, but we're seeing information that it could work in those that are younger, those that are older, those that have less severe disease, or those that have more severe disease. And so whenever a trial or whenever a study works or doesn't work, people continue to look at the data to understand a little bit more of what happens. Now, as I said, I have no idea what happened in the AstraZeneca. I don't feel I wouldn't want to comment on it, but I would want to just say that people continue to look for trends and for anomalies and for considerations so that they can plan their next study better, and that they can really understand who this intervention might work best for. And so I've definitely seen that where studies have been considered failures, but they've gotten really great information about how they could turn it around and potentially make it a successful product. And usually that involves limiting the population in some way.
Thank you for explaining that in such a delicate way too, and very educational to the audience as well. Tonya, did you want to say anything or add anything before we kind of wrap up?
I think that, again, in regards to just the different COVID vaccines, that that explanation of emergency use authorization versus approval is very critical and important. And, that there still will be a great deal of work to be done, even when we're beyond the immediacy of the pandemic, to make sure that these vaccines and treatments are safe and effective through a more traditional approval process. So, I think that stay tuned. Hopefully it still won't take the 10-year mark that we're accustomed to in new drug applications. But nonetheless, I think that it is a very promising time. And the FDA has been extremely responsive to the pandemic.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think that I just appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be on a panel with two esteemed guests.
Thank you, Tonya. Megan, did you want to add anything?
No, I really just wanted to say, well, thanks, Lauren, for inviting me to present and asking me. I'm so excited to be here, and Tonya, it's been wonderful to be on a panel with you, and really thank you to all the attendees. I'm happy we had a chance to talk, and hopefully you found all of this information useful. I definitely found Lauren's topic very, very informative and useful for my knowledge.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you both for being here today and conducting this panel and these talks, and the attendees for tuning in as well. I just wanted to mention our next two webinars very briefly. AAIDA's next two webinars are going to be on February 16th with Dr. Emily Hatcher, and then also on March the 2nd with Dr. Kasab of Charlotte, North Carolina as well. And I encourage our attendees to go to our website and register for those. It's www.godoaida.org/webinars. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you will stay healthy and join us for our next webinar. Thank you and have a great day.